Okay. Well, for those joining the live stream, this is one of our infinite series of meetings about new features in Wolfram Language. We've got a number of items today. The first, I think, is very straightforward. String take drop. Okay, so we have take drop, which just has just breaks a string. So like 4, for example, will do that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Seems like string take drop is an obviously useful thing if one's iterating through a string. By the way, we're hearing a bunch of background noise. Sounds like it might be an echo or something.
So it would return a list of 2 strings.
I think so. I mean, just exactly analogous to take drop. Somebody needs to adjust the audio stuff. Okay. Okay, that was really simple. Okay, let's move on to the next item that is much meatier, I think.
Right. So we have been implementing a few improvements and changes in data object recently, but we haven't done the parallel thing in time object. So the discussion is how to proceed.
Okay, so let me just understand. I mean, so if I want to, for example, go, let's imagine I'm doing a data object of now and a granularity of day. Okay, that's nice. And let's say I do a granularity of millisecond or something.
I don't
You don't have that?
No, I don't think we have that one.
Okay, so instant is that.
Mm-hmm.
And do we have second?
Yes.
Yes, we do. Okay. 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 What is the ultimate purpose of time object? Well, for example, yes, it could be a generic time within a 24-hour period. So is it the case, if I want to do a generic April 18th, how do I do it?
Well, right now we don't have a language level version of recurring dates or date patterns like that. It's one of the general topics we're looking at discussing for dates, but there's been some back and forth in trying to figure out, what the ultimate purpose of it is, because, the primary uses we have for recurring dates are in scheduling, so things like cron jobs, or in indicating things like holidays, which are kind of a special version of scheduling, or doing some sort of patterned extraction. Say, I want every 4th Tuesday in the month from this time series to do some aggregation for. And the way that we want to generalize that means that we can't, we've looked at the idea of having, data object of, the year parameter being none or an underscore.
Yeah, we talked about that, right?
Right. And the problem generally is that that's kind of a restrictive design in terms of having general dates. We can use it if we basically want to have something like April 4th, but we can't necessarily say every Tuesday with that notation, or every 4th Tuesday.
Okay, so, when we invented granularity, that was a thing like this. So the issue is, you want to be able to have essentially a date pattern that represents any date of a certain. Now, some things aren't date patterns. So, for example, 2018 isn't a date pattern. It's completely anchored.
Right. One could conceivably look at it as a pattern, where you say the pattern is this is the year and any time within that.
But I think that's a different thing. I think that's more granularity. I mean, the pattern would be, it's, imagine there was another, common era, so to speak. This would be the year 2018 with respect to, it could be a different calendar system or something like that. It's something that we don't, different calendar systems are one thing, but that's a different thing. I mean, it's like, if civilization restarted 100,000 years from now and there was another 2018, then that will be what that's about. And that's not what we are, that's not what we're building our product for.
Right.
So if we go back to the April, it could be the case we want to say any April, right? We might want to say any 18th of the month. We certainly might want to say any first of the month.
Right.
And any Wednesday and so on. So, I mean, there's the notion of there's the notion of any and every, which might be different notions. So if we say any April, I think this is a useful construct. I mean, so the question is, what kind of a thing is that construct? So if I take a look at that, for example, okay, so this is a date object, there's its main payload, there's its granularity, there's its calendar type, and there's its time zone. Right?
Yes.
Okay, so the question is, what could this look like? What would the thing look like that is the any April? Right, so roughly any April is, we could say, any April is sort of that. I mean, as you said, it's a different thing to say that there's an arbitrary pattern. I mean, there's two different things. There's one thing which is the structural pattern, which is any April, so to speak. Right? Another thing is this whole elaborate collection of possible, of alternatives, basically, that says it's a date that matches that is in the following sequence. If I'm making sense. So
yeah.
These dates which are structural patterns seem to me different and treatable in a different way than the arbitrary, collection of time points.
So it might be relevant to the discussion here. There's a futurized ref page called Date Select, where I was trying to sort of generalize the idea of using named elements.
Okay.
For, again, changing the idea from this structural approach to being potentially a element based. So using the same elements we have in date value, where we could say, this in particular is, here's a bunch of dates. I want all of the ones that match this particular criteria. But where, in this case, the basic implementation uses named slots that refer to date value elements. And
how on earth would you pick those up? So in other words, you turn the date. So that's actually, I think, the thing we don't have, which is to turn a date into an association, which says year, arrow, blah, month, arrow, blah. I mean, I could imagine having some alternative form of a date object in which that's how it works.
Yeah, some sort of like we looked at the idea of having, that as a flexible constructor input, or I'm not sure about having that as sort of an internal representation.
Structure input, that seems useful. If we say date object of year, month, whatever, as an association, that seems like something that could be useful. The problem is that date value has a lot of extra stuff in it that isn't, it's not literally, you don't want to literally generate it for an association.
Right.
So how were you handling that in your date select concept?
So the toy implementation of it would basically did date value extraction for the parameter you named. So if you said,
I see what you're saying. Yeah,
so for a lot of them, they're not like super important elements of the, whether it has an AM PM in it or not is not particularly structurally useful. You can look and say, is the hour greater than blah? But
why is that equal to Monday the symbol?
Because for day name, which is the function that returns the day of the week, it returns a symbol.
So day name is a so if I do
day name of today.
Well, if I say date value of let's say now, and then I say day name, I'm going to get back a symbol.
Yeah, the default is a symbol. Date value you can specify if you want it as a string or something else, but
where do you specify that?
As a third argument.
Okay.
Yes, in some of these you may want a string or a real value or a quantity. Some of them, there isn't a quantity of day name, so it will complain. But
I see. But so how would you handle that? I mean, this is sort of an interesting construct here. I mean, that you want to be able to say, I mean, but then there's the other thing, which is select from the continuous sequence of time. I mean, we have this date range concept, right?
Right.
But
Date range is the same as range.
What's that?
It's the same as range. Yeah, it's evaluated.
Right. As opposed to something which represents the date interval, which we don't have yet. Is that correct?
That's correct. We don't have it. Their third example in that ref page has a prototype notation for, there's a date interval. So the example above that one, yeah. So select a date interval of give a start and end point and say, I want all of the days within this that are a month of August. Like.
Yes. Okay. So, I mean, in a sense, you've got what I'm talking about here is a date cases that works with a date pattern.
Right.
The motivation for this extended language was that these date cases cannot handle weeks, for example.
I understand. With a structural pattern, you can't handle weeks.
Right.
Okay. But so is there a role for so what you're imagining then, these are all literal outputs. They do not represent, they're not solving the problem of representing any April or any Monday.
Right, that's correct.
Concretely extracting particular, Mondays or whatever.
Yeah, the couple of times I've tried to look at it, I haven't found a clean way to represent a generic or a recurring date, where we can specify this sort of element-wise criteria or a cases like pattern.
Okay, so why isn't it something like a pure? I don't think this is the right name, but a date. What will be the right name? I mean, this is so. Let's imagine that we said, day name equals Monday. Let's imagine that we had an object like that represents any Monday, he says. I don't think it needs to even have the day name equals. I mean, it's just like it's sort of an any date. This isn't quite right.
So let me suggest a possibility that we have been discussing sometimes, which is that the actual elements of the list we put in the first argument of the date object depend on the calendar we use. So if we had a calendar in which the list contains weeks, then because it's, for example, year, week, day, hour, etc., then we could handle weeks.
What aspect of weeks? I mean, we just have a numbered week in the year, but it might be inconsistent.
Yeah, well, so the archetypical calendar of this is the ISO 8601 standard has a year-week calendar where the first element is the year number, the second one is the week within the year, and the third one is the day within the week. And they have a specific criteria for determining this is the first week of the year, and if there are 52 or 53 weeks within the year, and how that gets handled.
Fine. Well, if history had been different and the Babylonians hadn't invented months or whatever, then we might be working with ISO whatever. But as it is, for sort of all of recorded history, we've ended up with months and so on.
Yeah, so, and it doesn't generalize to other calendars, and so there's.
Right. So I don't think that's really that. So the issue is, let's imagine we had a construct that means any Monday or every Monday. And I think those two concepts are a little different, every versus any. Okay. So then what we might want to do is say, date cases sort of within this date interval, blah to blah. What are the things that match that, the any Monday thing? Another thing we might want to do, this is sort of a resolution of that pattern object, an explicit resolution of that pattern object. Much as here, I mean, that's equivalent to this, isn't it? Because in my theory, where crit is that same type of thing, it's precisely equivalent to date select of the date interval with a criterion.
Yeah.
So what are the other use cases? All right.
So the other two prominent ones besides strict selection are time series sampling or resampling and notation for scheduling / holidays.
Okay, well, let's look at time series sampling. Okay, so let's say I want to pick out, what was the temperature every Monday? Okay, so let's imagine that, let's get a time series. Okay, so let's say, by the way, I don't even know how to, I don't know where it's going to think here is, but who cares? What happens if I just say here, quantity 3 weeks? Does that work?
I'm not sure what it would do.
It would mean the last 3 weeks. I think that's something we should make work.
We've generally tried not to mix too much the notion of duration quantities and dates up. You can
no, I know, but this is kind of a painful construct. I mean, it's explicit, but it's kind of a painful construct, and everybody kind of knows what you mean if you say air temperature data for 3 weeks. I think for these things where the second argument is a time spec, which is the case for this, for financial data, and for a few other things, I think we should support the idea where if that's just a quantity, it's basically equivalent to now minus the quantity to now.
Okay.
Why don't you suggest that to, I guess it's Michael who deals with this.
Yeah, I can mention that.
Okay, so we've got a time series here. And what you're saying is, let's imagine that we just want to get the values. So let's imagine from that time series that we want to get the value at 6 a.m. every day. Okay. So what would be our method for doing that right now?
Let's see.
So we have
offhand what I'm not sure offhand what the best way to do that. Gosha would probably be better able to answer that than me, but
I don't think we have a great way to do this.
Yeah, I remember, Jose, do you remember, we had discussed briefly with Gosha about the way she was using the holiday calendars to try and sort of create that artificial selection. Do you remember what the specific application was?
No, I don't.
Should we see if we can get Gosha to join this meeting? Is Eric here?
I'll call him.
Okay. Okay, so does that work? Okay. So let's say 1 week ago. That definitely isn't going to work. So 1 week ago. Okay, so this will resample. We got an echo again, by the way. Okay, so that will give us a smaller time series. We got an echo again somehow. That gives us a smaller time series. But if what I want to get out of here is the temperature at 6 a.m. every day, how do I do it? Okay, so that's one issue. And in a sense, what I would want is to be able to say, given a time series and given a list of times, time 1, time 2, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, I want to be able to apply the time series to that list of times. Now, I think I can do some of that, right? If I take that time series, I say this time series here, line 30, and I say, let's say 18 hours ago. That is not encouraging at all. I thought that worked. People understand what that's supposed to do?
Yeah, it's weird that it's got the failed head.
Well, the whole thing is weird. But, you know, it's not trivial because it has to do interpolation. And if there's missing data, it's got to deal with that.
Right.
Okay, well, let's wait for Gosha to show up.
She's here.
Oh, okay.
I'm here. Hello.
Hi. You're a little hard to hear. If you can speak up somehow, it'd be good.
We'll try.
Okay. All right. Are you seeing my screen?
Yes, I can see your screen. I'm trying to see what's going on.
Okay. So I got a time series of temperature data last 3 weeks from here. And I thought I could just put in a time as a sub-value there. I did that and it went bonkers. So is that correct, what I'm trying to do there? Right? I mean, I should be able to do that for a time series, right?
Yeah.
That's very weird. By the way, I don't think this is, but could we please fix this documentation to use something not as ancient as this?
Okay.
Okay, so this is certainly showing the exact same thing. So why isn't this working? So if I say mean of %30, oh, is that the problem? What happens if I say, I mean, that's wrong in its own right, but if I say delete missing from %30, what's it going to do?
No, it's not going to do anything right now. What the thing that we can do right now is to, when you create a time series, you can input, you know, the missing data method as automatic, and it for the time series, it would just interpolate, you know, have a linear interpolation in place of the missing. That's what we do, what we can do right now. And the mean result, right, it's also correct because there were the missing, you know, objects in the values. So that's what.
Okay, but by the way, this should probably do something reasonable.
That's in the works. It's working towards that.
Okay, so if
yes,
I say
that's
missing
in the plans, yes.
Data method
goes and
to
automatic.
Why is there no auto-completion? That is a bug. There should be auto-completion for that, right? Sushma knows how to report those.
Yep.
Okay, so now if I do that,
yeah.
And now if I try mean of that, it works just fine.
Yes.
And if I say %38 sub, you know,
No.
18 hours ago, let's say. Oh,
this I'll have to figure out what's going on here because that's bug.
Yeah, I think you meant %38, not %30.
Oh, well, that would help.
Oh.
That worked. Okay, so that problem has to do with the treatment of missing.
Probably, but I will have a look anyway.
Okay, I mean, what do you think it should do?
Well,
I mean,
I don't
if it's
know.
far away from the missing data, it should just work.
Well, so normally, if it's between the timestamps, that would interpolate. If it's outside, it would extrapolate. And if it falls on a timestamp, it should just give you the whatever the value is. So the fact that it shows failed, it just indicates that there is something, you know.
Yeah, it's a bug of some kind.
Yeah.
But in any case, what I'm saying is, right, so the interpolation, if it's linear interpolation, it doesn't, if you're away from the place where it's missing, it's all going to be fine.
Yes.
Okay. All right. So somebody on our live stream is saying you should distinguish between date intervals like 3 weeks and absolute date intervals like dates between now and now. Absolutely. That's exactly what we're doing here. Okay. So what we're talking about is if I want to get, all right, so the way to select, so if I wanted to get the temperature at 6 a.m. every day, right? What you're telling me is if I went to line 38, I could say date range. Let's walk through how this would actually work. Okay, so right now it would be now minus 3 weeks. But how do I get 6 a.m. each day? Somebody? how would I get the date range, which is the 6 a.m.s of each of those days? Nick?
So generating specifically at 6 a.m., we don't have like a great function for it. You could do like a current date plus 6 hours on.
That's grotesque.
Yeah, I mean, we don't have like a date coerce function to basically say, take this date and turn it into the appropriate.
Right. Well, so what this is instead of the granularity where you say, given a particular time, so granularity means given this instant in time, get the enclosing
step,
second, week, whatever it is, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Now, there's a different thing, which is given this granularity, get the one or more instances of this thing within that granularity. So it's kind of like date select, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, in other words, if this said date select of, let's say, I mean, it could just be today, comma, and then it could be, what is the right term for date value? Let's say, hour.
Yeah.
Well,
hour equals 6 or.
Right. So what that should return is a list that corresponds to those times. You know, that should give you a list of things. And this seems not completely silly. So if date select is given a certain granularity,
there's an implicit.
What granularity
range.
is it returning? Because what you might think is, you know, in other words, so this date select thing has, so date range goes from start to stop and with a certain step. And what granularity does it return?
So the general paradigm has been maintain the granularity of the starting object. So if you put in days, it will try and return days. But we try and have it operate in, you know, if I say I want to run from today till tomorrow in steps of a minute, getting back a bunch of repeated things that are all the same day isn't very useful.
So,
we
let me just look at the inverse thing. So if I say, let's see, if I want to get the sunrise, so let's say I say date range, you know, today minus, you know, 1 month, okay, to today, and that will now do it in steps of days, right?
Yep.
And if I now say sunrise of that, it's going to give me that event series. And now if I say date value of that, comma, hour, oh, come on. Why didn't that work?
I mean, date value is primarily designed as an extraction function.
I know, but let's go to normal of %43.
On the dates, maybe.
Okay, so there I've got my, no, that's complete nonsense. How do I get out the dates here? That sunrise thing, how do I get the individual dates? So I could say values of that time series, right?
Right.
Okay, great. So that's sunrise at those times. So now I say date value of that. What the heck? Oh, I see what I want. How do I get the fractional day?
So there's day fraction or day exact will give. And it'll need to be %46.
Okay. So let's say if I say dandy, weird. Oh, I wonder, that must be, what the heck is that? The little wiggles there. Who knows?
Yeah, I mean, the resolution for sunrise is in minute steps, so there may be It doesn't actually look like there's repeated elements, so it may just kind of be the resolution we're working at.
Yeah, okay. All right, okay. But so the question now is, if I wanted to get, again, let's go back to my time series, okay? If I want to extract let's see, if I want to extract the thing, let's return to what we were saying before. So we could imagine a date select that gives us a list of specific dates at a certain granularity. I don't know what the granularity is, that match a particular criterion here.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Where this could be a date interval, but it doesn't need to be a date interval. It could just be, it could just say date select, and we could have a simplified syntax of year, for example, which would mean the current year.
Yeah, each granular date has an implicit exact range. Today is from the first moment of today until the last moment. This year is January 1st through December 31st.
Right.
And so
someone on the live stream is asking about date deltas versus, yeah, let me show you how it works. I mean, if I take two dates here, I can just go ahead and subtract them, and I will get a date delta. And I think all this just works. And I think date interval, what's that?
Yeah, our date deltas are quantities, they're durations of time.
Right, which is, I think, exactly as you would want them. Now, okay, so let's go back to this date select. We've again got this weird background noise. Maybe we could debug that.
It's Jose's stream.
Okay.
Okay. Okay, so let's go back. All right, where were we? So we're talking about something, a piece of functionality we don't have now, which is how to get. Now, presumably, by the way, these both date value and date select should work on time series and should select those pieces of the time series. What does, there is a time series select, is there not? No, there is not.
There is not.
Okay. All right. Okay. So does this seem like a reasonable function? I mean, this is what you were proposing here, over here, right? And is this compatible with what you were proposing? You're saying there's a list here. I'm saying just have a date interval or a granular date object.
Yeah, I think both of those certainly work in the same way. The main difference there in terms of the criteria is, do we want to have it be strings or named hashes? And
oh yeah, this is wrong. This is crazy. What I've written there is absolutely crazy.
Yeah, and so I think the current design I had there had a third argument, which is the first n cases. We may also want to have either an option or an argument to handle granularity. We can do an automatic one and say, if you're looking in today and your specification is hours, they should probably be hour granular steps. But maybe you say, I want the hours, but I want them to be second granular or something like that.
Yep, I agree. Okay, so in general with select, do we have anything which has an option of granularity? They're all arguments, right now?
Yeah, they're all arguments.
How does it work in date range? Does date range have it? You said it just inherits the granularity of the start.
It does. For experimentation purposes, there's an undocumented fourth argument that will let you specify the granularity, because there's some weird edge cases where your step size may, we look at the step size to try and determine the units, but there may be a better granularity than the fact that you're adding 2 days, 4 days and a week, maybe you want them to come back as weeks instead of specific days or something like that.
Well, so what you're implying is maybe we should have a date granularity option that we can supply to all these things, including date object, which might canonicalize itself to not use that, but it could start that way. Is that what you're suggesting? And that way we can use the pattern of third argument of select as the count.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, right now I can't think of anything where having a date granularity option would be a problem or a bad thing. You know, in date object, it's perhaps a little redundant, but we already have a method for handling redundant specifications of, you know, this date object already has a time zone and I specify a different time zone. We convert from one to the other.
Yes.
So,
well, it seems reasonable to me. So then the next question is it okay to have this notion of the as if association type concept for that second argument? Because what you're effectively having to do, I don't even know how you could possibly implement this. I mean, you've got to go in and look inside there. And, you know, it's got to be lexically scoped because you've got to actually look inside what hash whatevers were there. Mm-hmm. See what I'm saying? I mean, how does this then work?
It's been a little while since I dug into it, but we basically, we look at the named hash functions and then try and do a quick, you know, we basically look at the parameters that each of those are associated with. So we know if we're looking at hour and minute, then we can ignore the other parameters and just look at
the other issue that we have here then is whether it's a string or something else. In other words, you've got to know for each of these, is it supposed to be like, for example, if I say day name, I would kind of expect that to be a string, but it isn't, in fact.
Yeah. Yeah,
However, it is nice to be able to say, okay, so let's walk through this again a little bit more. So let's imagine that I said hour greater than 6.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so what I would expect to get back is a bunch of date intervals. Right?
Bunch of date intervals.
No, not for today. I mean, let's say I said, you know, let's say this thing was this week.
Mm-hmm.
Why doesn't that work? Why doesn't that work? That's another bug. That's really weird. What happens if I say last week?
And you can do current date and take a look at that.
Well, okay, those are bugs.
Mm-hmm.
I don't understand why that didn't work. But okay, the selection there would be, I could say date interval of, you know, now minus 1 month to now, for example. And then what I would expect to get back here is the date intervals corresponding to, you know, corresponding to the after 6 a.m. each day, right?
Mm-hmm.
And similarly, then, if I were to apply this to a time series, let's say I have a time series, and I say that of this result, I would expect to get the time series with pieces chopped out of it. Gosha, does that work? Time series with disjoint pieces in them, where you simply don't give the, I mean, how do you specify that the time series is missing a certain number of hours? Do you have an explicit missing, or what do you do? Or do you simply not give those? I mean,
no, you can do the time series window, right? And then it's gonna just window the pieces that you want out of that.
No. But what I'm saying is, what I've got is a disjoint set of times over which there is a signal. See what I'm saying? You know, the weather station shut itself down between 2 a.m. and 6 a.m., let's say, right? And so in here, what I would have is, in this way of setting it up, I'm saying I want to select out of the signal. I want to know what the temperatures were at the time when the weather station was awake. Okay, so what I want is then to chop out those times that are between 2 a.m. and 6 a.m. and then I want to get the results. And the question is, how do you represent that in the if you simply leave out those entries, if it's interpolating, it's going to interpolate right across that period when it was asleep. Do you get what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
So let's see. I mean, okay. So what we're saying here, all right. So provisionally, okay. So I don't understand how this relates to time series. Gosha, do you have something to say about that particular issue?
No, because I think you would, in this situation, you would want to have two methods of interpolation depending where you are.
Yes.
Right? Yes. And so we don't support it at this point.
Okay. So we should think about how to deal with that. So, but that's a separate thing here.
Yeah.
Okay. So I don't see a way. Okay. So this is reminiscent of the, I'm now going to, okay. So in a slightly hacky way, we could create an association here that, in other words, let's say in the case of handler function keys, handler functions keys has an analogous issue. You know what I'm saying here? What a completely crazy example. Well, anyway, whatever. Okay, so handler functions keys is being given. That is very weird. What is this doing? You guys, people here know how handler functions keys works?
I'm not familiar with it.
Okay, so the way it works is there are handlers which do things upon particular events. And the question is, what is the argument structure that is fed to the handlers? Oh, you know, this is right. This is right. So the handler here is being given the evaluation result. There are many possible handler function keys, okay, that submit functions that submit the task. So for example, session submit will have many possible handler function keys, okay, which means that the actual handlers that are being used in following events can be generated. Okay, possible keys specified by handler function keys. You see where I'm going with this? So in a sense, what we're doing is we've got an as-if association, and the question is what keys are going to be generated for the as-if association.
Okay, yeah.
And what we're saying is, what I'm suggesting is there's an automatic choice of that that's based on inspecting the actual expression. But in principle, you could specify the explicit list of keys. So the full form of this might look like, I mean, we'd have to give, if it was an argument, for example, we'd say infinity here, comma, and then we'd say list hour. And that says, go get the date value for hour and return the association hour, arrow, date value of blah, comma, hour. Get what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
Now, I'm not sure that even works, because in this case where we're doing, it's hardly as if you can say date value of this date interval, right? By the way, we got a bunch of seashore background noise, which I think is Gosha's fault. So you might want to put yourself on mute.
I'm in mute if this is the server room bothering you.
I don't know. Are you sitting in the server room?
It's right behind my back, but...
Wow, I thought the server room was completely closed. Well, who knows? Wait a minute. It's, well, must be the main one on the 6th floor?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
But how does it make noise? I don't understand that.
I don't know, but...
But it's completely closed, isn't it? Well, who knows?
But there is something, you know.
I see. Okay. All
getting in the air.
Right.
When you hear it, then it's hard to unhear it.
Fair enough. Okay. So, let's see, where were we? So I don't think this works, right? Because what you're doing here is you're extracting, I don't even know, how would you implement this? Let's talk about that. Nick.
Yeah, so for the date interval case, it's a little tricky. I mean, basically what we end up doing with the basic implementation we have now is that we look at the implicit interval and we look at the keys that are needed. So in this case, hour, and we basically generate an explicit range that we can then pull
That's not good enough. Look at this case. Hour greater than 6, that's not good enough.
Right.
If it's hour equals 6, it's fine. But I think we want this case, don't we?
I think the problem here is that we are mixing the discrete case with the continuous case, and that's potentially dangerous.
Well, you mean something which can return an interval. I think we're going to need that. I mean, in other words, of course, okay, so this is a case where we can do a comparison. But for example, days after Monday, how do we deal with that? How do we represent that? Because we can't say day name greater than Monday. That's kind of crazy.
Yes, but I think date select should still return a list of particular dates. They may have different granularities, but they should be all date objects, not date intervals.
Well, so you're denying the possibility of hour greater than 6 then, because we can't represent hour greater than 6 with a date object, because date objects only live on these granularity points that correspond to, that are centered on named values, like a named hour or something. You can't go 12:30 to 1:30.
Right. It would have to be a date object for 12:30, one for 1:30, one for.
See, I think though that's useful, because to be able to say 1:30 to 2:30 every day this week, right? You could do that with date select if we allowed something other than, okay, basically the issue is, do we allow, so date interval, okay, if date interval specifies something which is on essentially the granularity point of an hour, for instance, if it was 2 to 3, actually, I don't know how does that work? Granularity of an hour at 2 o'clock, it's not clear that represents 2 to 3, is it? It's not at all clear that represents 2 to 3. Look, I think the functionality that we can get by having inequalities as well as equalities for this is very useful.
But perhaps they need separate functions, date select and date interval select. And then you know what you are going to get back.
Why does it matter whether you get a granular date object or a date interval? I mean, a date interval is a granular date object that just doesn't happen to be aligned on the granularity boundaries.
Well, we don't have other functions solvers that we don't know whether they are going to return numbers or intervals, right?
Let's come back to my statement, because I'm not sure it's correct. Is it the case that the granular date, the hour-wise granular date, 2 p.m., is the same thing as the date interval from 2 p.m. to 3 p.m.? Is it the same or is it not the same?
I don't see them as the same thing. For me, the granular object is a discrete object that has its own algebra, and then the other one is a continuous set of instants.
Yeah, you may be right. Okay, so you're proposing the possibility of a date interval select.
Yes, and that would always return date intervals that maybe even point-wise, in the sense of having the same beginning and end if necessary.
Well, but what's the difference then? That date select could only give you, if you said hour greater than 6 in date select, it would just fail. Is that right?
Or it could return a list of all the hours after 6 or something like that. It's just a different interpretation, something that will work in the discrete world.
I see what you're saying. No, returning all hours after 6 would make sense there. Okay. Yeah, I think that's reasonable. All right, so maybe Nick, you could try and actually implement date select. Right?
Okay.
Including this idea that whatever interval it is. So can date range can't take an interval like that.
It can't really. I mean, a lot of the functions that operate on date ranges right now use a 2 or 3 argument start date, end date, and potentially step. With date interval, we'd basically smush two of those arguments together, and date intervals themselves are intended to be contiguous. So there isn't really a step size associated with them.
Yep. Yeah, there's no granularity in a date interval.
Right.
A date interval is just a slab of time.
Yeah, this moment to this moment. It could be infinite past to infinite future, or beginning of yesterday to end of tomorrow. But there's a discrete starting and stop point, at least.
How are you doing with the temporal logic business?
Depends how much time we want to spend talking about it. We're moving along, and Jose's been doing a lot of reading about it, and we've gone over Roger's old PhD thesis and a handful of other things. So we've got a generally good idea of the hook-ins to linear temporal logic and how they relate to modal logic, but we're still kind of playing around with how it integrates into the language in terms of setting up the various relationships between this eventually happens, this always happens, this happens until this period, etc.
But let's talk a little bit about how that relates to this. Okay.
So effectively, we have a collection of new logical operators called things like until, eventually, next, and they take predicates and potentially a time to express when.
Well, so maybe it's temporarily next, and things like this, right?
Right.
And eventually. Mm-hmm. So you're saying, so what would be a thing that you would say? You would say eventually such and such, eventually P. Is that right?
Yes, it's yes, exactly. We have propositions whose truth depends on time.
So eventually P is the assertion that at some time in the future, P will be true. Is that correct?
Exactly, yeah.
So what would be an example of a piece of the, so what would it mean? Let's say that P will be true sometime this year. How would you represent that?
Sometime this year. So,
well, there exists a time. Okay, so this is a case. Mm-hmm. Exists a time this year when blah 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 blah.
Yes. So here. So sorry, I need to think because we have several of these operators. So basically, the fundamental ones could be said to be until and eventually. So we have one in which we can express that something is going to happen until some other things happen. So this is until P, Q.
Until P, time, yes? Or until P,
the operator typically used in temporal logic relates the truth of two different propositions. So it's P, Q. And this is something that holds now. So the time is now. So we know now that P will hold until Q holds. And then we don't care whether P holds or not. This is the sort of things that...
So what's the relationship with actual times, the temporal logic and actual times? So until, this holds until...
Well, Q could be given a time itself. Q could be something that we know that will start happening only at a given time.
And how would you represent that?
I don't have.
Is it basically true when?
We could represent that statement by having the date there, and then we have that date objects are statements. It's like a deltas in time, something that happens at the. It's true at the time that they represent.
I see. So it's effectively a delta function. So in a sense, that is saying, true at or true during.
Right.
True during some time, which might be a granular time.
Right.
Okay.
And this would be like a true until. So P is true until Q is true.
Right. So true until is an assertion.
Yeah, it's like
so
true
what's the
until
difference in while? I mean, so while, if I say, I mean, because I can imagine something where you're actually running a process and you're saying, you know, I mean, this is the symbolic version of true until.
Yes. Yes, but what I'm saying is that the general case is having two propositions. The having a time is a particular case of that.
Yeah, okay, fair enough. Okay, so let's go back. By the way, SWSH on the live stream is asking, does a date interval from future to past make sense? I assume that's the null interval. I mean, I assume like it's if I say something like the interval from 2 to -2, like this, what is that now? Is that, how do I say, what is the, if I say region measure of that?
Well, interval sorts.
Oh, I see it just sorted right there.
Okay.
Okay.
It's not clear that we want that for time intervals.
I wouldn't have thought we do. Okay. Yeah, I mean, interval is not a directed interval in the case of the number line.
Right.
Should it be for a date interval? Not clear.
Yeah, I think we should preserve orientation, because orientation for us is going to be very important.
Yeah. Okay, let's loop back here. So we've got a possible idea for date select and date interval select, and also date interval itself. Now let's go loop back to the original discussion. Wow, that's a lot of random times there. Which is the time object. Okay, so time object is an example then. What the heck is time object? Time object wants to be a generic time within. So in other words, if I say that time object and I add a day to that time object, what on earth happens? Like this time object here, okay, is in my time zone. And that time object is that. Okay, great. Now what happens? So if I say time object of now, okay, that'll do the same thing.
Yep.
Okay. All right. So if I were to say add a day to this time object, okay, so that time object plus 1 day.
Because we preserve the head, it basically remains unchanged. It does actually, you know, if you add half of a day or something to it, it will change the offset. But if you add anything in a multiple of 24 hours, it will not end up changing.
Now why is that correct? What happens if there's if the daylight savings time changes?
Well, in this particular case, the time zone it's using, since it's selecting it from the system and it's just a numeric offset, the daylight savings doesn't get accounted for in that way. But because
it's GMT, right?
Yeah,
I meant GMT -4, which is an explicit time zone relative to GMT.
Yeah, versus if it was using your dollar time zone entity, that's probably America/New York, which is Eastern Standard Time.
Why doesn't this give something in Eastern Time? I mean, why is it giving it as GMT minus whatever instead of printing it as EST or whatever it is?
Right now we're doing that because dollar time zone has been a real value since version 2, and we introduced time zone entity and support for time zone entities in version 10, I believe. And we want to transition to using, you know, modern time zones, but we didn't want to switch over the second that we added it. So we have
Do we
support
have a
for
plan for this?
Yeah, I mean, I think the discussion was going to be, the next major version would be the earliest where we want to.
Well, let's talk about it, because the next major version is almost upon us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think it makes sense to shift to these time zones. They're, a modern notion of what a time zone is, and we have good coverage.
Yeah, I know. 30 years ago, we didn't have the same opportunity. But
Mm-hmm.
okay, so question. That's a separate discussion. Okay, but so what you're claiming is that this time object, I can perfectly well add, once it has a time zone, it's a little bit funkier to add a day.
Yeah, I mean, there's the central dogma of time object has been that it doesn't care what any given day is unless you give it to a function that needs to know the day. If you say date list of a time object, it needs to know what the first three elements are. And so it will say, okay, I assume you're talking about today because I don't have any better information.
Okay, fine. So this should do the same thing. If you add something, it is going to need to know that, right? It's going to need to know that in order to add a day to a time object, it's going to need to know which day you're talking about. And it will have to assume, I would think,
that you're talking about today. Mm-hmm.
Actually, adding a day, it's not obvious what it should do. It's really not obvious, because it could be that you want to add the granular day as opposed to adding 24 hours. Okay, let's come back to this question about, okay. This question about a generic time, okay, how does that relate to what we were talking about before?
I think it's related in terms of, we don't have a generic date object that floats around where you can say, this is the fourth day of any month or the fourth day of April, but it doesn't matter what the year is. Time object has sort of existed in this weird headless form where you can say this is a time object. We know it rotates around on a 24-hour clock. You can give it a specific time zone, but if you try and instantiate it to any given moment, it just has to assume you're talking about today. And I think, since time object hasn't propagated throughout the system extensively, we've used it in places where it's applicable, but it's kind of more of a narrow construct than date object is. The general question, and sort of if we want to update it to include granularity, is do we want to think about time object being just 24 hours on a clock that always tries to reduce to a specific moment in time? Is it generally assumed not to have a time zone unless you say it needs to have a time zone? Or are we thinking of it as a specific version of this generic date concept? And if that's the case, should we explore that in more detail rather than saying
I think
time
we
object?
want it to be a time object to be a time zoneless thing.
Mm-hmm.
Unless, I think that would be a much better use of this, is to have it be time zoneless. Mm-hmm. And it only locks into a time zone if you're doing an operation that requires, anchoring to a time zone, just like it only locks into a day if you, a specific date. It's like, we could get ridiculously ornate. So, for example, let's see. So the question is, okay, to be very ornate, like, for example, I don't think we're accounting for the change in the length of the day, right, with seconds, are we? Have we?
There's no formal notion in the language of how leap seconds are handled. The variations in time system or time schemes, UTC versus UTC0 versus TIA, et cetera, that's something that we're looking at as part of the astronomy work that Jose has been doing, because we need that granular control. But in general, the language basically assumes that it doesn't need to keep track of leap seconds. It just looks at what your system clock is and assumes that goes back.
Right. Although the time difference between now and last January 1st does depend on leap seconds if you care about the, it down to the level of seconds.
Right.
Yes, so that will have to be a new option time system that specifies whether you care or not.
Right.
And by
Okay.
default,
And I mean, that's going to get very ornate. I mean, by the time we're dealing with changes in the length of the day, and it's very ornate.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So again, with time object, the question is, should there be a time zone in the time object? Gosh, I can see.
I think, our sort of easy path is to say the default is to have none, but you can specify one if you really want to.
Yeah, okay. Well, what does time zone none mean?
So the way we handle, so I think a quarter of the way down the page there's an example of time object with time zone goes to none.
Oh, okay,
what that basically means is if you, so if you send that to me, it will still be, 3 seconds past. Oh, that's something we added relatively recently. I guess you're probably in version 11.3.
Okay, so this is coming in the new version.
Yeah, and so the idea is that, normally in a data object, when you create it, the time zone's instantiated when you create it. With time zone goes to none, we don't instantiate it unless you do something that says, I need to know the specific moment in time. And at which point it'll assume your $time zone. But the notion here is you create that time object, you put it in a cloud object, I read it, it's the same time. It still says there's no time zone, even if we're in different time zones.
Right. On the live stream, Flip Phillips is making an interesting point that scenarios like temporal data, when you measure EEG or something, you really don't care. You care that this happened 1 hour and 6 minutes from the beginning of your recording. You don't, well, you might care actually. It might matter. What was the circadian rhythm point for the poor person whose EEG was being measured? But generically, you don't think you care. You just care about a start time relative time.
Yeah, and there's a similar relationship with audio processing, which we've looked at with Roger a little bit in terms of
the time objects.
Yeah, and how time objects relate to things like durations, where.
Okay, well, so what is our thinking about? So this is okay. So this is a time zone none time object, and so if I say that plus 72 hours, okay, then what's going to happen here? Oh gosh, this is a version that doesn't. This is a version where I can't connect to the cloud yet. Okay, well, in any case, what's going to happen here? Is it going to mod 24 hours?
Yeah, it will basically mod 24 hours in the resulting object.
Okay.
I think this is correct because time object is not a duration. It's just the time of the day when you don't care about the actual date.
Okay, but so let's talk about Flip's version of time relative to the beginning of your experiment. How do we deal with that? Because as you say, in the audio case, I mean, we have exactly that situation, right? I mean, if I go ahead and capture some audio here, hello there. Okay, I'm going to have audio where I could want to do. So how do you? Does anybody here know how do I slice off? If I say audio window, is that right? What do I do to get a piece of that audio? Audio sample. Oh gosh, none of you know. So much for that. Okay. Audio trim. All right. So I could, for example, trim the audio to a particular. Okay, so that's the first T seconds, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so this is the case from start time T. So that is a quantity relative to the start. Well, that's not so bad, actually. I mean, if I say audio trim of the audio from it's from a certain quantity, or in other words, okay, so one question would be, does the audio know the absolute time? In other words, this audio was recorded from the security, microphone or whatever at, 3:22 p.m. or something. It doesn't know that, does it? Does anybody know how that works?
I don't know the answer, but in principle, I don't know why it should not. I mean, why it should have to record that.
No, I understand. It wouldn't record that. The question is, if you wanted to record that, can you record the absolute, physical time at which an audio recording is made?
Right. That could be metadata, for example. It
could be metadata, but then the selection. I mean, right now with our time series, right? Okay, so there's a question for Gosha here. Okay, so in our time series, is it the case that the times are always absolute? Or can you have purely relative times?
So no, the timestamps are the moments in time that exist.
Well, but if I say all I care about is how long since the beginning of the time series this particular value is occurring at, I don't care. It's 3 minutes and 22 seconds after the beginning of the time series. I couldn't care less whether that's 4 in the morning or 6 in the evening or this year or last year.
Right. I mean, so you can input an integer and a reals or integers as a timestamps. So in this situation, when you recorded audio, it goes from 0 seconds to 0.02 seconds.
Okay, so then what would happen if I had that? Okay, so there are a couple of different cases then. So let's imagine here, I've got my times, my thing here. I'll even use the interpolated one just to be nice. In %38, right? I'm going to take it and I'm going to say %38, and then I'm going to say 2.5 days. Didn't work.
No, because that's the duration.
Yeah, but that's not, because the other interpretation of that is, since the values that you would, okay, look, if you were going to give this, if you were going to give a time series where it says, it says 0 and the value is 6. And then it says 1 day and the value is 7, right? 2 days and the value is 18, right? That should be a valid time series, is it?
No.
Why not?
Because you, at this point, you're mixing the quantities with the 0, which is the integer.
Well, I'm sorry, but that 0 days, what's 0 days going to turn into?
It stays 0 days.
0 days.
Okay, fine. All right, so that's a valid time series. Nope. What did I do wrong?
Because at this point, this is also something that I'm looking into. We do not accept quantities on the timestamps.
I think we should.
We should, and I agree with you. And this is in the to-do list.
Okay, all right. But let's assume we do that.
Right.
Then I claim the consistent thing to do here is that means give me the value 2.5 days after the beginning of this time series. Right?
Well, if you had started at 2 seconds, then it would be 0.5 seconds after the beginning.
Wait a minute. If the value of the first timestamp was 2 seconds, and then I say 2.5 seconds there, oh, what a mess.
No, I think if you get, these things should always be absolute. If you give days with some numbers, then when you input a value, it means the same thing, like we do with dates.
No, but wait a second. So what we're saying here is, okay, so there's an ambiguity. In the case where a time series has absolute times in it, right? And then I say, show me 2.5 days there. That kind of means 2.5 days since the beginning of the time series. look, one of the things, and actually Flip is pointing this out on the live stream. Oh, it says it's Flip's birthday today. Happy birthday. Since we're talking about times, right? The question is, how many leap seconds has Flip accumulated in his life so far? In any case, the question is whether t equals 0, whether there is a representation, some symbolic representation for the beginning of the epoch, so to speak. Right? Because right now we have now, and now represents in physical time, so to speak. Well, I'm confused. I mean, in astronomy, this issue comes up all the time, right? Relative to the current epoch, relative to whatever else it is.
Yes, right? But you always assume that both the inputs in the first argument of time series and then the input you give are referred to the same epoch.
Yeah, okay, in that sense of epoch. But what I'm saying is, if your time series is a recording of the motion of your snail starting from t equals 0 for the next 18 minutes or something, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Then the issue is, and the way that that's specified is with something very much like this, right? The snail recording device is every 5 seconds it gives the snail position, and the first element there in each case is 5 seconds, 10 seconds, 15 seconds, and so on,
mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah.
Then the question is, if I want to get, then it's perfectly reasonable for me to say, where is the snail after 18 seconds?
Yes.
But now the question is, if I recorded instead the absolute time, the snail started its journey at 4 p.m. and continued wandering around until 4:15,
mm-hmm.
and now I want to say, give me the position of the snail 5 minutes after the start of the time series. How do I do that? Gosha, how would I do that?
Through the time series window.
No, I would say you have to use the time of the beginning plus 5 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
That's right. Which means that you have an ugly thing where you're saying how would you even do that? I mean, if I have the time series, there is no symbolic representation of, I mean, in other words, I could say something like beginning plus 5 minutes.
Well, you have the first time, yes, or first date. First time, it gives you the first time of the time series. Okay,
so if I take that time series and I say first time, no, what do you call it?
It's a property. So you if it's our time series, it's first time.
I thought we had, but duration. Okay, so first time gives. What the heck is that?
Yes, if you want a date, you do the first date. This is absolute time.
That's horrifying.
The date that it's a first date.
Useless. Okay, that's horrifying.
We did created this operating in the absolute time before the date object was introduced. So that's why there is.
Well, I think it should be largely deprecated, that particular thing.
Right,
so,
but as to function somehow. Duration also works. It's the difference between the first and last, yes.
Okay, fine. But so what doesn't work is something like this. Because otherwise, this is a pretty ugly thing. You've got to repeat that time series. You've got to say that whole time series, okay, there. What you've got to say is this thing of, let's say I want to find out the weather, okay, plus, 4.5 days. That's getting in the pretty ugly category. I mean, it's good, it works.
Would it be acceptable to have a string plus
no.
4.5?
No, absolutely not. No string. We're not going to add strings. That's a slippery slope where we're going to, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it would be acceptable, possibly. I don't know. Is it acceptable? And this relates again to the temporal logic business. It's like beginning plus 4.5 days. Is that a meaningful time? Where beginning is a symbolic thing.
Well, some of the references I've read use the word start as a symbolic thing that is in the syntax. Like we have true and false. There is start.
Yeah. I think it would be better be called beginning rather than start, because start has too many other meanings of verb form and so on. But in any case, it doesn't really matter. Or time origin or some such other thing.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so if there was a thing called beginning, I guess there's also ending then, and those are symbolic things. Oh, that's a weird situation, right? Because how would that relate to I have to go, by the way, soon. Yeah, go ahead.
The now we have a first date, and then within this property maybe about adding quantity. So then you call it once.
Sorry, say that again.
If instead of beginning, we can think about having a first date plus this quantity of 5 minutes, and that we could maybe parse.
No,
this
we're not going to do strings, and we're not going to do arithmetic with strings. It's horrifying. Yeah, so Flip here is suggesting, that there's an option called epoch. The word epoch is such a confusing word, I have to say, but one can have a better version of that, where what that means is what the time is relative to. So the alternative here would be something like this, where in the meaning of the word epoch, which I don't, it would be something like that, which means this time. So it's like a time zone. An epoch then becomes a bit like a time zone.
Yeah, epoch sounds much bigger.
Epoch is the wrong name, okay? So let's say this is time origin or something.
Right, that's, yeah.
I'm not sure that's right either, but that would be the way of determining. See, I don't think that's right. I mean, I think it would be better to have, or alternative, yet another alternative would be relative time, blah. What do we think about that? So where else would that be used? Let's imagine there was a notion of relative time.
I mean, I guess there was the example you gave earlier in the stream where air temperature data of here and 3 weeks means 3 weeks relative to today, which must go backwards in time. But
well, that's a minus relative time.
Yeah, it's implicitly moving backwards because the function knows that it can't move forward in time.
Yeah, it's a little bit cruddy, but the question is, what would this, so in the time series, there are two things. Again, okay, so let's just understand. In the time series, there's either, input for the time series is either absolute times, and I don't mean absolute times in our sense of crazy integers and things, but I mean, it means physical times, so to speak, okay?
Yeah, data objects.
Right. Or the input is purely relative times, right? And then again, the querying can either be in absolute times or in relative times.
But relative times are durations, they are quantities. And so we could interpret quantities in the first case as referred to the beginning, but in the second case, it couldn't be. They have to be referred to the inputs.
Yeah, I know, but that's the problem. No, you see, the problem is, okay, so look, this is the problem. There actually isn't relative times. This isn't correct. This is merely, okay, so there's actually three different cases. There's the input absolute times, there's the input quantities, or time specified times, but not dates, okay? Which looks like quantities, right? It's going to say 1 day, 2 days, 3 days. Okay, you know what the problem is? This isn't relative times. This is just quantities.
Right.
Because it doesn't necessarily start at 0.
Exactly.
So the problem is here, what does it mean when you ask for day 1.5? If I'd started with, you know, day 1 here, and I had gone to day 3, and now I ask for day 1.5, what do I want? See what I'm saying?
To me, because if we removed the days and we had only integers, it would go simply interpolate between 1 and 2.
Yes.
I think it should do the same thing.
Okay, but we also want the possibility of relative to the beginning of the time series, which is this construct relative time or something.
I would prefer the beginning plus, but
okay, fine. Okay, so I think beginning plus is interesting and reasonable, but where else would we use that? Someone on the live stream is talking about relativity. We have multiple people on this call who understand that business quite well, but we are not going to solve the relativistic problem here. We're going to solve part of that problem when we do astronomical times, right? We have to do some of that. Is that true, Jose?
Yes, indeed.
No, Flip is suggesting time object versus timing object. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, that's a possibility of something like a relative time object. I don't think that's right either.
No, I think quantity should cover that quite well. All the cases. It's just that if we want to refer quantity with respect to some beginning or other beginning, we need a way to specify the beginning.
Right, but what else will we use the beginning for? Other than in time series, where else will we use the beginning?
Well, in temporal logic, for a process that has a clear beginning, could be used.
How?
Well,
okay, what is the value? Okay, so beginning, what's a little weird is, you know, that first date thing, it's, you know, that's an extractor that takes a time series and gives, you know, and gives a specific first date, first time, whatever in the time series. Okay, this is an implicit representation of that, and there's something a little odd about having both of those flapping around. In other words, beginning does resolve. Okay, so there's a calculus of times that are relative to the beginning that could be its own. So for example, we might say beginning plus 5 minutes, and then we might go, you know, add 3 days to that, and then we know how to do that. It's just beginning plus 3 days plus 5 minutes, and so on, right? If we had a second beginning there, and we said beginning minus beginning, what does it mean? I mean, in other words, it's like degrees centigrade or something. There's a, you know, beginning. Okay, so like for example, beginning minus beginning. What is it? Is it 0, or is it indeterminate?
No, I think this would be symbolic. It would give 0. We end up with a quantity, and we complain because we don't know how to refer that quantity. Or perhaps we assume that
if this is a data object.
Well, what's the data? But I mean, somewhere. Okay, resolving this by saying the beginning is at this physical time, so to speak.
But no, beginning in a time series that contains date objects will be implicitly a date object. But in a time series that contains quantities, it will be implicitly the first quantity.
Yeah. Okay, but so where else could this occur? I mean, so for example, the subvalue construct is not used in, is it used in, for example, date interval? You know, a date interval, in a sense, has, I mean, I don't think this is a particularly correct syntax, but something like date interval, blah, 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 you know.
For example, I'm thinking that Michael right now wants a geotrajectory. We are working on a geotrajectory. So we are going to have the same prompt there, beginning of the flight.
Oh, very interesting. Yeah, right. So the geotrajectory could be an absolute time. The space station went over at precisely this time. Or it could be when I start driving to Timbuktu or whatever, 300 hours into the drive, I'm at this place.
Right.
Yeah, that's interesting. So the geotrajectory would have, I see. So in the case of the geotrajectory, one would be able to select, how would one select part of the geotrajectory? You'd have to have its own function to do that, or can that be selected with, for example, date select, for example?
I haven't thought about that yet. So the idea was to have some sort of part spec-like language, and if whatever we do for lists of dates or some date span or something like that should be eaten by geotrajectory.
Yeah, but geotrajectory fundamentally is like a time series, except that, and what's the difference between a time series where the values are geopoints and a geotrajectory?
Well, geotrajectory knows how to handle the geo details of things and will be able to compute the velocity from when you are moving and things like that. So somehow it knows that it represents something moving in curved space around the Earth.
Yes.
So it's a lot of information that...
Yeah, but internally, I mean, like, for example, the time series functionality should presumably work on geotrajectories, yes? Like, why not time series window should be able to work on a geotrajectory?
Perhaps, I mean, we would have to generalize all these linear things to the curve case, and I'm not sure.
Which linear things? You mean interpolations, for example?
Interpolations and computations. I mean, you can add two time series. Well, it's not clear that you can add.
Oh, no, you can't add two geotrajectories. That's crazy.
Exactly.
Right, that's a good point. But you could take the difference between two geotrajectories. Imagine you have two paths, the path, whatever it is, the less taken, whatever that imagine you have, you're tracking wolves or something, and the pack all starts together and then they diverge, and you want to know, you have geotrajectories for each wolf, right?
Yes.
Then you could imagine subtracting two geotrajectories, and what would you expect to get? You get a vector field, basically, that shows the difference between the wolf positions.
But it's not exactly that. In the same way that we cannot subtract two geopositions, we cannot subtract, but we can compute, for example, the geodisplacement between both. And that will return perhaps a time series of geodisplacements or something like that.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense. Because the geodisplacement value, right, then it has turned itself into a pure time series.
Yes, I think so. But it cannot be just subtraction, because the geopositions do not form a vector field.
Fair enough. Okay, so then what is the relationship? So then geotrajectory, the time aspects of a geotrajectory are perfectly, number liney.
Right.
It's just the geo values are not simple like that.
Exactly. The values are geopositions, effectively. So they have to follow the algebra of geoposition, which is more complicated.
Is there yet a generalization? So, I mean, basically, your point here is this is living. Okay, but in geotrajectory in space, in XYZ coordinates, is Euclidean. I mean, in XYZ coordinates, you can do the subtraction, right?
You can, yes. You would have to work with vectors from the center of the Earth, yes. But in principle, with geotrajectory, we are not committing to any particular kind of coordinate system. We will be able to query and say, give me in lat long or in one or the other one.
Just looking ahead for a second, and I really have to go because I'm really late for something else. When we have astro positions, is this going to work the same way?
Well, if we have some sort of orbit, and we describe an orbit as something that depends on time, we will need something similar, yes.
Although that has yet more horrifying stuff, like an orbit is periodic.
typically.
Yes, and a geotrajectory could also be periodic. We could have the satellite following a geotrajectory.
Yes.
Something like that.
Yes. Have we even thought, even for a moment, about the relativistic stuff for the astroposition business?
I have thought a bit, and it's also important for the time systems because there are time clocks that there are time systems that take into account the fact that you are on the sun or on the Earth, and the relativity is different.
You mean for gravitational redshift reasons?
Exactly. Yes. So this is all measured, and there are parameters to how you move from one time system to the other one.
But just jumping ahead for 1 second, and then we really should wrap this up. I mean, so if you have an astro trajectory, for example, right?
Yeah.
Clearly, there are relativistic things going on there because the astro trajectory. Well, I don't even know. Look, if you have an astro position on Mars, for example, right, with a 20-minute propagation delay,
yeah,
what the heck is that? So I see. There's a time system. How does that work?
The important thing here is distinguishing the description of what is happening right now in some time coordinate system with what you see if you look at it. Then
Yes.
When you see is when you have to take into account that there is a shift in time between one thing and the other. So things can be moved. So we will have to be saying something like, what do you see from the Earth at that time? And then we will have to trace back in time where things were and take into account those things.
But so the actual, I mean, to be sort of technical about it, I mean, there's a bunch of space-like hypersurfaces that define the moments of time.
Right.
And those things are space-like in the sense that they are not, there's no, you can't actually, you can't get from one to the other. They're just some kind of foliation of space-time. And that is the ticks of your clock, you say, are based on that. Different from the observation of where, the planet is or whatever else.
Exactly, yes. So it's like when we were computing eclipses, we had to take into account the fact that the light takes 1 second to go from the moon to the Earth. And so things will be shifted 1 second if you don't take that into account. So relativity here means basically finite speed of light.
Yes.
That's the first approximation. Then in a second approximation, things get moved by Lorentz factors and things like that. But that's a smaller effect.
Okay. But so your point is you can perfectly well define an astro trajectory with respect to this time coordinate system that's defined by this series of space-like hypersurfaces, which is in a sense not observable, but nevertheless can be specified like that.
Exactly. So you need to know whether you are referring to the one based on the solar system barycenter or the one based on the center of the Earth or the one based on some other galactic thing. So you need to do coordinate changes. But once you have defined a coordinate system that covers everything as much as relativity allows, then you're fine.
What was that? As much as relativity allows? What? Because,
for example, on the rotating Earth, you cannot define something that covers completely the whole Earth because we are in a non-inertial systems and things like that. So there are issues that force you to have these coordinate systems to have a maximum size.
What? I mean, wait a minute. There are coordinate. Why does when you have black holes and things, then you have all kinds of weird coordinate chart stuff. But why do you have that for just a pure rotating Earth?
Yes, when you have rotating effects, you cannot have global coordinate systems that cover, global reference systems based on light rays and things like that. This is the so-called Sagnac effect.
I've heard of that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I didn't think that. Okay, so we're going to run into that?
Well, the coordinate systems defined based on various planets and things, they have a size that it's the size that makes sense.
Well, are you saying, I mean, look, clearly I see. Here's a simple way to understand that. If you have the XYZ coordinate system going out from the center of the Earth, then at some point, as you go far enough out radially from the Earth, your rotation speed will be larger than the speed of light.
For example, yeah.
Right. So it gets completely crazy at that point. Right. So, I
Right.
mean, while you're in low Earth orbit, it's far, far away from that. But if you were to go out, you know, I don't really know how far, but you know, a rigid coordinate system, maybe even out to the edge of the solar system, might start to give you trouble. Is that the origin of this effect? That you can't continue the coordinate system outward because you end up with some kind of necessary relativistic effects.
Right, and in fact, the coordinate systems that are used based on the sun, for example, are non-rotating because they are aligned with some distant object which is supposed to be non-rotating.
Yes, I understand.
To avoid this type of effect.
How subtle. Okay, all right. Okay, well, we have degenerated into something kind of complicated here. All right, well, good. Thanks. Okay, so I think we've made some good progress here, and we need to pick this up again. But why don't we work through what we already figured out here? And thanks to everybody on the live stream. I won't say we fell down a black hole at the end because we're not even considering those kinds of effects. But anyway, got close to that. All right, thanks all. See you later.